Secret of Nimh was Don Bluth's first animated feature from his own studio. These days, it's appreciated by those who enjoy animation, and it did get good reviews at the time, but for a variety of reasons didn't do well at the box office. Overall, it did less than $15 million, which was still profit considering it cost about half that to make, but it was not enough to keep Don Bluth Productions from filing bankruptcy. Despite having to file for bankruptcy twice in his early career away from Disney, once with Don Bluth Productions and once with Bluth Group, he kept at it and later teamed up with Steven Spielberg to create An American Tail, which fared far better and at its time of release was the second highest grossing non-Disney film. So, like all reviewers who review animation, we once again return to Don Bluth, and specifically his first full-length animated film and his first successful full-length animated film. Let's look at An American Tail and The Secret of Nimh. What do these films have in common? Well, the main thing is that they're about mice and were directed by Don Bluth. There is also a strong family element to both of them. Starting with the protagonist herself, Mrs. Brisby. Mrs. Brisby's motivation in this film is saving her son. She's a widow and she lives with her 4 children on a farm. Every year they have to move when the plowing starts, but Mrs. Brisby's son Timothy is sick with pneumonia and can't be moved for at least 3 weeks as the chill in the air will most likely kill him. Mrs. Brisby is willing to do anything to keep that from happening. Now, as strange as this may sound, this is probably one of my favorite animated female characters of all time. One reason that I admire her so much is that she doesn't really fit any of the common female archetypes. She's not an independent, tough chick who doesn't need help and is all self-reliant and in your face about it, or someone who proves that she's independent but then constantly has to be rescued. She's not a helpless maiden who can't do anything for herself. Basically, she's a mother who really, really loves her family. Her attitude reminds us that bravery isn't the absence of fear, it's doing something even though you're afraid. Mrs. Brisby is willing to go to any lengths and face certain and uncertain danger despite the fact that she's terrified most of the time. She's very kind, but she has her limits, and she knows when to ask for help, but can also get herself out of a bind. I think the moment that really sets her character is close to the end of the film, though. Throughout the whole movie, most of her bravery comes from wanting to help her son. But towards the end of the film, she volunteers to drug the farmer's cat, which happens to be the very thing that killed her husband.
About dragon, maybe? Oh, nothing. Goodbye. I volunteer for dragon.
Oh, no, Mrs. Brisby. Nicodemus, this is no job for her.
Please.
The whole time she was obviously terrified, but there's something so admirable about doing this thing that she didn't have to do despite her fear. Bottom line, great character, moving on. Jeremy is an interesting character. At the beginning of the film I found him really annoying, but by the end I was probably laughing most during his scenes, mainly because of how pathetic he is. Every conversation he has with Mrs. Brisby is so socially inept.
See, I'm all right.
That's not the reason I'm crying. I lost Timmy's medicine.
Ah, don't cry. I hate to see a woman cry. Hey, was I great or was I great? Did you see that cat out there all dripping and wet?
Somehow, this makes him likable. Of course, it helps when it appears that the other characters in the film feel the same way.
I need lots and lots of string.
String.
To move the block.
Move the block. Hey, I've got strings. I've been saving them.
You do?
Oh, sure. Red ones, blue ones, green,
Pay
yellow.
attention. Go get all the string you can.
Okay. That'll take all day.
Good.
We don't spend a lot of time with Mrs. Brisby's kids, but they seem to be pretty believable children. Teresa's the oldest of the 4 and seems to be the most polite and sensible. Martin is the second oldest and is a little outspoken. Cynthia is the youngest. She's clueless and exhibits high levels of cuteness. And Timothy, for the most part, spends the entire film just sick with pneumonia. Another character on the farm is Auntie Shrew, who seems to be that one nosy, irritating neighbor who's kind of arrogant and self-righteous, but is also not so bad and pretty reliable when you're in a bind. Mr. Ages I adore. I love the scenes with him and Mrs. Brisby. He's a suspicious, somewhat brash old mouse, but again, not too bad when you get down to it. He seems to double as a doctor and is for the most part kept somewhat mysterious, mainly because of his relationship with the rats of Nimh. The leader of the rats is Nicodemus, who is the wise, sagely, wizardly type. He's kind and intelligent and wants to help Mrs. Brisby because him and the other rats knew her husband Jonathan, and he wishes to repay her for her husband's help. Then there's the captain of the guard, Justin, who really is very much like the typical hero. Actually, if this movie had just been about the rats of Nimh, he probably would have been. Justin is an idealist who doesn't believe that as evolved, intelligent rats, they should steal from the farmer. Him, Nicodemus, and Mr. Ages are trying to convince the rest of the rats to leave the farm and find a place of their own, but are having trouble because of the villain in the film, Jenner. Jenner thinks that the rats should stay on the farm because they have everything they need there. I suppose the best way to think of it is that Justin and Nicodemus are really on the more evolved side and want to be more than rats, and Jenner, though intelligent, still wants to sometimes think like an animal.
I've learned this much. Take what you can, when you can.
Then you've learned nothing.
There are other interesting characters with less screen time, like the owl, who only has one scene, but damn is it a good one, and Jenner's, well, I suppose you'd call him Jenner's follower, who manages to redeem himself at the end of the film. In any case, this movie has an amazing cast of characters regardless of how much screen time they're actually given. Fievel is a typical child. He's curious and sometimes gets himself into unfortunate situations because of it. He's kind but a bit naive and is actually pretty resourceful for, what, a 5-year-old? I admit there are times when he seems a bit overly cutesified. A lot of times that sort of thing isn't really for me, but this film knows how to pour on the sadness so that I empathize with him at several points in the film, and he is pretty likable. I also like his family, especially Papa Mousekewitz, who seems a little more fleshed out than his sister and mother. There are a lot of other characters in this movie. Don Bluth really seems to like to cram his films full of characters, which, I mean, they're usually pretty likable, but half of the time they barely get any screen time. I addressed this in my Titan AE review. Granted, it is better done here because it seems like these characters do have something of a role to play, but there is still part of me that really wishes we could take our time with some of them. For instance, there's Tony, who is introduced briefly, vanishes for a bit, comes back, falls in love very suddenly, and then goes back and forth between usefulness until the end. Bridget, his love interest, has even less to do. Then there's Tiger, voiced by Dom DeLuise, joined at the hip with Don Bluth, apparently. He's actually introduced towards the end of the movie. Him and Fievel sing a song about being buddies, and then he disappears until the conclusion, which is a bit of a letdown considering the antagonizing situation between cats and mice in this movie. Plus, I wouldn't have minded seeing how that conversation between him and the mice went, precluding that final scene where he's carrying them around in search of Fievel. Seems like a missed opportunity for what could have been a pretty entertaining moment. Then there's that French bird voiced by Christopher Plummer, and damn it if this doesn't feel familiar.
Take heart and then come to town. Hope for the best, work for the rest, and never say never again.
Sure to do impossible things if you follow your heart. Your dreams will fly on magical wings when you follow your heart.
Oh, fuck. Well, to be fair, this came before that movie. Still, between the French accent and the song about not giving up, I can't help but be reminded of Thumbelina. The funny thing is that I have the urge to compare the moments and say something like, "Now you see, this is how you do it right." Singing a song about never giving up has so much more meaning in a circumstance when you're talking to a 5-year-old who is separated from his family in a new country, rather than, getting off of a lily pad? But I can't really do that in this situation because Don Bluth directed both films. So yeah, obviously he already knew how to do this right. Horrible flashbacks aside, this character is fine, and I rather like this song. If anything, because it doesn't get stuck in my head like the plague. Then there's Honest John and Madeline Kahn. Weirdly enough, I feel like these characters are probably represented the best, at least in terms of side characters. I like them. He's a drunk who is concerned about elections. She's a rich snob. It's kind of like in The Secret of Nimh, where half of the characters kind of come off as assholes at first, and then they grow on you. Lastly, again, is the villain, in this case Warren T. Rat, who is actually a cat in disguise. Sort of wondering about the size difference in this situation, but hell, I'll bite. Honestly, not too much more fleshed out than Jenner and The Secret of Nimh, but still decent as far as villains go. Overall, these characters are also good. I would have liked to have seen more of them, but that's not the worst thing you could say about a group of characters. So, on to the plot. I love The Secret of Nimh. If you haven't figured that out, you haven't been paying attention. But I do have a few nitpicks when I watch it, like how did Jeremy get untied and how did that situation resolve itself? Or why did Justin have to leave Mrs. Brisby behind after she got caught? Her clothes and everything. What a douche. Did he himself really need to be there to move her house? You do know that if something happens to her, then regardless of whether or not they're saved from the plow, they're still orphaned and Timothy will most likely still die. That's just a little weird to me. No explanation, just see ya.
Come on, Jackie.
I'll have to come back for you later.
Ah, well. You ever notice how in old movies, scenes are generally separated by fade-outs and aren't transitioned in the same way that films of today are? Well, watching The Secret of Nimh, it seemed to me like every scene could almost be removed and examined on its own. And honestly, I feel like this film's genius is better realized if you look at the scenes by themselves. For instance, the very first scene with Mrs. Brisby and Mr. Ages is excellent. The scene with the owl, though brief, is very well done and is both frightening and mystical. That scene where Nicodemus explains Nimh to Mrs. Brisby is very memorable. Years after I saw this movie for the first time when I was a little kid, I remembered that scene, and that's what this movie does. You may not remember every detail, but this film is full of moments that stick with you.
Then, one night, I looked upon the words under the cage door and understood them. We had become intelligent.
That's not to say that it doesn't work as a whole, but this movie is essentially following two different plot lines. Because of this, it does tend to feel more like a series of moments rather than a completely flowing narrative. That being said, I'm glad it is. The rats of Nimh are easily the most fascinating thing in this movie, but I'm glad that it focuses more on Mrs. Brisby and her story, because that somehow makes the moments with the rats all the more strange and supernatural. Following this woman who simply wants safety for her family into this world that is bigger than her own leaves a lasting effect on the audience, and simply telling Justin's story, or whatever, wouldn't have had the same impact. So yes, An American Tail has an amazing story. The ending's a little bit cheesy, but you kind of have to forgive a kid's film for including a happy ending. Now, An American Tail, I hated this movie as a kid. I'm not even kidding. I genuinely hated this movie. Now, it's not for the same reason as, say, I hated Lady and the Tramp. Yeah, there are quite a few of these classics that don't really do anything for me. I'm not much of a cuddly, fluffy person now, and I was even less of one as a kid, but I didn't like this movie for a different reason. I hated it because I found it frustrating. Every time Fievel's family was literally an arm's length away, it stressed me out as a kid. It's not that I don't like sad movies, but depressing movies and sad movies to me are two different things. And depressing movies do tend to turn me off, and as a kid I found this movie very depressing. And yeah, still some of that in there. I mean, geez, how many times does this movie try to kill Fievel? Still, I suppose it makes the payoff at the end all the more gratifying. So what do I like about the plot? Well, one thing I liked is how certain things mentioned early on came back later. For instance, Fievel's dad tells him in his sister's stories about Rapunzel and the giant mouse of Minsk, and then Fievel uses that later to escape and then to chase away the cats. This film does seem to come full circle with a lot of the plot elements introduced later on, maybe even more so than The Secret of Nimh at times. As I've already said, the characters are good. The family element is definitely there, and I really do get the feeling of a strong bond between them, even when the family is constantly denying that Fievel is alive when his sister keeps insisting that she feels like he is. It's believable, as it seems to be done more out of pain than anything.
Mama, I keep having this feeling. The Fievel's alive.
Tanya, it will go away. After a while, it will go away.
Some of the story arcs do feel slightly rushed, but I think that it's resolved well enough during the course of the story to not hurt the film. Like Nimh, this movie feels more like a series of moments rather than a continuous narrative, and they are good moments. And I also like some of the songs. There are a few that I could take or leave, but I like Never Say Never. There Are No Cats in America is pretty fun, and then there's Somewhere Out There, which... Still, I like The Secret of Nimh a little better. Now let me make this clear. These are both good movies. I would recommend both of them. However, even though both films are done quite well, it's Nimh that sticks with me more, and that may just be personal preference. So they're both good, but at least for me, it was Don Bluth's first full-length animated film, and not his first successful full-length animated film, that was the most memorable. I'm the Animated Heroine. I'm just not interested in romantic stories about dogs. I'm sorry. I didn't like 101 Dalmatians that much either.